You are now listening to the Mental Health Check-In Podcast.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone listening at whatever time you're listening. As always, I am Joe Anthony Myrick, and this is the Mental Health Check-In Podcast, a podcast dedicated to spreading mental health awareness as a means to help us all heal. So let's just heal together. I'm happy to say that we've got our second licensed therapist on this show, second of the year, second of all time, and she's none other than Camille Banks-Lee, who's working straight out of New York City. Also, she's working on her PhD as we speak, among many other things. She's a busy therapist, to say the least, trust me. But I feel grateful that she was able to squeeze me into her busy schedule as far as her life and career goes, and was able to squeeze this podcast in, because she says a lot of valuable knowledge and advice in this episode, I think. I really can't wait to segue into it. But first, I gotta say that if you come out of this podcast as big a fan of Camille as I am, then I suggest that you follow her on Instagram at CBL Psychotherapy and on Twitter at Camille Banks-Lee. And if you live in the New York downtown area and would like to book a session with Camille, then I suggest going to her website at CamilleBanksLee.com, where you can book either an in-person session or an online session. Also, if you're a new listener of this podcast and you decide you're a big fan of this podcast, the Mental Health Check-In Podcast, then you can keep up with updates with us at Check-In Pod on Twitter and at Check-In Podcast on Instagram. Please give us a follow and a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps expand our reach and makes it more likely for people who need the healing to find our podcast. Like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. Again, expands our reach. And tell all your friends that we're available on all streaming platforms. And we're available on YouTube, which, if you're watching on YouTube and you're wondering why there's a big Eminem portrait behind me, head on over to upliftunited.com, go to the article section, and you will quickly find your answer, as well as a fantastic article written by Miranda Adama. But for now, again, if you're new, the way things work around here, I usually transition to the interview by saying, let's just, and then I hard cut into me in the interview saying, dive right into this, because transitions, let's just dive right into this. I'm good at transitions, I think. But nonetheless, this episode at least, is going to be a little bit different. We got to talking before the interview, before we started hitting record, and the pre-interview chat was just so strong that we just decided, hey, let's just hit record right now. So this is going to be kind of an in medias res kind of feel to the interview at the start, at least. All you need to know is that before we started recording, we were talking about Black trauma. And you kind of get the tail end of that conversation at the very start of this. And that kind of trails off into conversations about other things. So I hope you just enjoy all the things.
I just meant because sometimes it's important to get key components, and so that we might be able to be more focused. So I literally just I worked 9 to 5, and so I'll just give you a little bit of an idea. So on any given day at my community mental health clinic, I see people who are a little bit more require medications. I'll just say that. So their disorders are a lot more than depression, anxiety. They are inhibiting people from being able to work and being able to function. So I work there with a psychiatric team. But I will say that, that's on the extreme side of the spectrum. The majority of the people that I find are people that are like you and I, that sort of eat our traumas and overthink our traumas and are not sleeping well and aren't as aware of them. So like if you're not sleeping at all and you're outside sort of pacing and doing detrimental things and you're able to get disability because of your mental functioning, not that you've experienced trauma any less, but I find that people that probably would be listening to your podcast and the people, I'm more focused on those people that I would say are like in the middle, right? So if it were to be like oh gosh, I can't even think of what that graph is called, but like the hill with two extremes on the side. So like 20% of people who are very, very affected, schizophrenia, like very extreme in terms of needing medication. And then the 20% of people who are jolly and happy and they don't have triggers and traumas and they're not overthinking and they're not affected. The majority of us fit right there in the middle, that 60% that we are experiencing it, but it's not on the surface for us. So I find that the 20% tend to get more of the attention because they demand it. Whether they're suicidal in terms of their ideation and discussion, or I hate to use this example, but if you can see it, right? Does that make sense? If you can see it in terms of mania or their inability to be able to emotionally regulate themselves, it's probably a lot more intense. Most of us that are eating it, drinking it, sexing it, doing all kinds of other detrimental, like it's the same triggers. It's just that we're not necessarily outwardly letting the world know. So I apologize. I just jumped in with that, but I wanted to give that example because so in my mental health clinic, so I have a psychiatric team that I work with, but those are people that are either mandated to come because of court, because they've been hospitalized or they are, those people tend to have less time specifically with talk therapy, if that makes sense.
I think it does. You're saying that people who wear their disabilities on their sleeve are more likely to struggle the most because then they simply can't hide it, unlike you and me, for example.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is the higher numbers are really those of us though that are hiding it. Because I always joke that I'm not, and I'm teasing and being self-deprecating by saying this, but so if you have a weight issue of any kind, right? I say to people, you're wearing that on you because obviously you're eating more, and it's not always true because there's other factors at play like metabolism and other things. But we can clearly see that either you're eating more than was allotted for your body, right? Because otherwise it would be gone and there would be no tire. And right, but people can't see that so obvious. It's just so you can be an alcoholic, but if you're functioning and you're able to make it to work, you're not crashing your car, you're not doing those things, it doesn't mean that you're any less an alcoholic, but you might not have caused yourself as much harm. So that overthinking that we're doing, that we're waking up in the middle of the night 3 times, right, and not sleeping enough, so that manifests itself in other ways. It doesn't mean, right, but there are people who then won't go to work, right? So I know when I wake up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and I can't go to sleep, everything still has to get done, right? And I apologize. You got a real glimpse into what there was this movie once called The 24-Hour Woman. It was she just never got to sleep because there were her kids, and then there was her life, and then there was her afterlife, and then there was the work. So you almost felt when does she ever, it was a movie with Rosie Perez, when does she ever get to think or just not be on? But with this pandemic, I think one of the most interesting things is that it's hitting into traumas. So not just the pandemic. So it's the pandemic combined with George Floyd and the reawakening, right? I say reawakening is because we were already, right? So Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon, we could go on and on. So for many of us, who have been so affected by this on and on and on, Breonna Taylor, Sandra, the Sandra Bland, this is just yet another thing. So for us, that was cumulative trauma. And it's interesting about your question. So it just reawakens for us the feelings of, apathy towards the rest of the country. It's like we've been telling you this. Like this is there is absolutely nothing new. Tamir, Trayvon, like we're talking about little kids, right? Michael Brown, we're not talking about adults, and the idea that that we can't that not only can you not make mistakes, you can't be human, but that cumulative trauma, it is impacting us, but we are not we don't have an opportunity. I apologize. So we're always working, and we're also always having to do many things at once. So we don't have the opportunity. So many of us, did you march? Did you participate in any of the social justice marches?
I wanted to, but unfortunately, because I'm immunocompromised, I didn't think it would be the safest thing for me.
I'm glad you did not.
Mhm.
It was not the safest thing for you to do, but it's all. And that was actually an interesting point about like a sort of like apocalyptic, multiple things happening at once, right? So it's like black and brown people have at least in urban cities, we have much higher incidence of asthma. We have much higher incidence of obesity and diabetes. All like a lot of the things that were like, don't get COVID because this is one of the reasons why these populations might die. So you can't go out there and protest. So it was like, yeah, let some of these other people protest, right? Because we've done this. Um, and so I brought that up to say our cumulative trauma at this point of financially being broken and like trying to figure out work, because lots of work has been compromised, and then what does this mean for us right now, um, around our individual trauma and then our collective trauma as a community. So when you're talking about healing, it requires a lot of individual work. So one of the ways as a community we healed historically, right, was through um, church. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Right? A healing circle where people came together, you sang hymns, we dressed up, and a lot of the reason that there was a belief in that, but we want to be like there's someplace better than this, someplace where we're going to get treated better than this, right? So we've seen, whether you're talking about, there's a huge resurgence of information. So the Tulsa riots, I'm sure you're right. You're familiar with it, right? So lots of people were not familiar with that. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, I feel like a lot of people didn't really know until like that show Watchmen came out and covered it in
Exactly.
different ways.
Right? So then Watchmen comes out, and then Lovecraft Country, right? And it's an interesting thing because for many of us, we're like, been there, done that, knew this. But now, because it's in an entertainment, right, it's much more palpable because we can visually see it, we can understand it, but there's a lot of people that they really didn't want us to know that there was this level of greatness, and that there was also that amount of terror inflicted upon us, right? Um, and honestly, I think it's super painful. So we tend to want to, like, let's just talk about music, right? When you think about, right? So it's like, let's go to an entertainment place because it's really a lot easier and a lot more palatable. That's why when um, we're talking about taking a knee, and I don't want this to turn into a political piece, and I'll go back, but all of these things sort of combine and layer into our mental health, because how can you feel safe, right? So part of mental health is feeling safe, and the other part is like having something to look forward to. So I'll give you an example. Joe, what are you looking forward to in your life?
This next interview that I have in an hour from now.
Right. So because you have something, but you created that, right? So if you didn't have something, you created it. And so you're a co-conspirator in the idea of the things that make you happy. So if your job wasn't making you happy, you found something to make you happy. So mental health is difficult because, so by nature, there are going to be challenges that each of us have, right? We're going to have bosses that aren't respectful. We're going to have relationships that don't work out, things that are going to interfere with us. So, our regulation and our ability in our humanity, the way it affects us, right? So, if you're told black men don't cry, you're strong, you're right, you're a threat, you're aggressive, there's not an opportunity for you to fully flesh out all of the emotional aspects that you have. So I'll just go back to say that, like, so if social emotional learning was done earlier in a real way in school and in the way that officers, right, so when a police officer comes to talk to you, what are some of the feelings that you get when he first comes and taps on your window?
Well, I'll admit, I don't know if I could say privilege. I guess maybe lucky. I've never had that situation. I've been driving for only about 3, maybe 4 years now, and I've never been pulled over yet.
Yeah. Have you had any encounters with police ever?
I've had a couple like very close calls, but like the closest I can really remember was maybe 2.5 years ago. I was the GPS on my phone was, I don't know if it was just a bad connection or if it was just broken, but like it was basically like the middle of nowhere. I was stopped at a stop sign trying to just figure out where I was at, and there was like a cop that was like the next like road over. And when I finally did drive away, the cop was suddenly driving behind me. And I noticed that every turn I was making, like, oh, they're following me. And I don't even know where I'm going. I'm being followed. This is different. So that went on for about 5, 6, 7 minutes, and they end up just making a left and just leave me alone. But like that was just being followed was a terrifying feeling itself.
Okay. So that's exactly, so what you said, I was waiting for the terrifying, right? So that terrifying feeling comes from accumulatively, you didn't need to directly have had an experience with a police officer for you to be terrified,
Hmm.
correct?
Right. There's been situations where I'm like in the vicinity of like a cop car, but I wouldn't really feel scared because I'm thinking, oh, I'm not doing anything wrong. They're not thinking about me. I'm not thinking of them. I'm just going to drive normally. But in that instance where it was very clear that this police officer had targeted me, that's where the terror set in. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I do. And the reason I'm saying is that, so those are things that happen beneath the surface for us, right? And so if you live in, and it's interesting that you would bring up the idea of privilege, because I would say that my kids, I grew up in a much more higher crime, um, less affluent. I live in a upper middle class neighborhood, right? And I mean, there are lots of black families, but it's definitely an upper middle class neighborhood. And so that's a very stark contrast from where I grew up with projects, like I'm just saying, right, where people were selling drugs, playing basketball in the street late at night, doing things, right? So the police were always an adversarial. I think that my sons probably would still, in some ways, they're young, look at the police as like their friends in some, but only beginning because of these kinds of things. But just learning how to regulate your emotion, right? So this is the way black men talk, right? Like, so you have to talk a certain way and you have to look a certain way and you have to, right? So all of that's traumatic if that's not in your natural nature to be who you are. Somebody's telling you that what you are is not good enough and that you need to sort of, turn into this other person. So mental health right now, we are actually at least 200 years behind other races because, like, so, and again, I went to very traditional schools. I went to NYU, I went to Columbia, I went to Fordham, all in New York, very, right, white, wealthy, but Freud and a lot of the teachers and a lot of the young and the mental health practitioners that I learned about didn't necessarily use black people as models, but they used the brain, right? And the brain as a model. And so one of the books I want to just show you, because and again, I think some of this is boring. That's why I said we can talk about the things that are not boring. But there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's about brain, mind, body, and healing of trauma. Are you familiar with this book?
Yes, I'm a big fan of that book. I actually just finished reading it about a month, 2 months ago.
See, I didn't get any of that recognition. So, it's not a book that I would run into, right? And so you're a geek like me, right? And so that's a book that we would be interested in because I devour, right? So it's super interesting. I don't know that this would be as interesting to people who are coming in and suffering. Would you agree with that?
Um, I think that it would be helpful people who are suffering and knows something going on with their body. Because I think I was talking about this with therapist Cynthia Sieda a couple episodes ago, and we also name dropped the book in that instance about how stress levels, emotional levels that can produce like a bodily response where like you feel it physically, like you feel whatever emotional stress you're going to, you may feel it in your body, you may feel physical pain. And if you're wondering why am I feeling this physical pain in my body, then I think that book is like a good recommendation.
I do. The hard part and one of the things the best part. So I was going to tell you that. So when I work in the community mental health clinic during the day, these are people who don't have private insurance. They have a lot less access. The education, right? So the reason I brought this up is this is a higher level. It's written, by a doctor. So if you basically just graduated high school or didn't even graduate high school, it would be a hard read. I'm talking about, in other words, the vocabulary and a lot of the topics around the brain. But, right, you're right that when I'm explaining to people what's happening for them, right, this is the book, right? This is the book. But I'm left to sort of process it in a way that makes it like tenable for them so that it doesn't feel like. So that's the thing about class and about access to education. So I have to sort of switch because I wouldn't just recommend this for every person that comes to see me. There are certain people that absolutely was the most appropriate thing for, um, because it really also talks about healing in the book and really more specifically what happens to our brains, and you had started to say that because it's what's not on the surface. And one of the things I love about therapy is, so it's often what we're not saying in the session. It's not what we're saying, it's what we're not saying, um, that can be of most interest and most valuable. So, when I go to talk to my therapist, and especially when I'm feeling super avoidant, right, I'm going to tell her about all kinds of stuff. And this happened for Thanksgiving, right? And she says, right, and then I'll give breadcrumbs as to what's really bothering me. And she'll go there, and I'm like, oh, I just told you about this fight, right? And she's like, I know that's what you wanted me to hear, but that's not necessarily the most important part of what you said. Um, but it also is, it's difficult, those things. And just like when we're talking about trauma, most often they are not easy things to talk about, so they actually don't get on the table, right? And so, and my private paying clients in the evening, if you want them to continue, right, you're not necessarily going to pick at the scab, right? Even though, right, you're like, oh, that's great that you told me all about how you went to the bowling alley and you haven't bowled, and you're excited about it. But then you mentioned that, your loneliness, right, had caused you to, eat more, and that you've noticed that you're drinking a bottle a day. And they're like, oh, is that a lot, and making jokes about it, right? But they know that that's probably not what they should be doing right now, in order to sort of process and deal with that. Tell me, what have your other topics, what have your other guests talked about? I'm just curious.
So many. Like, I think this is gonna be like the 19th episode when it comes out. So it was a lot of ground we've covered. We've spoken about triggers a little bit here and there. We've talking about I'm having a brain fart right now trying to think of everything we've talked about.
That's okay. So one of the things I did a presentation on a few weeks ago, was how do you know when it's time to go see a therapist, right? How do you know that now is the time? Um, and what do you think? When should a person see a professional.
When you're noticing, this stuff is different for everybody. Like, I think that if you're dealing with a sore pain that you can't just work through with the simpler suggestions, like the average person might say, if you were feeling stressed out or can't get over a certain situation, exercise or do this, do that. If those seem too simple, I suppose, then you may need to consult therapy. Or if you're dealing with things internally that you know that something's wrong, but you can't really find the words to explain what's wrong, a therapist is really helpful to provide that insight. And in more extreme cases, straight up, if you're just like, for example, suicidal, that's when you really need to talk to a therapist or some type of medical professional, psychiatrist or a therapist.
Yeah, no, the most important thing was the first thing you said that resonated with me. It's individual for each person, right?
Mm.
So some people come to me because they want a safe space to vent or to feel that it's confidential, and they're asking for counsel. It's my least favorite because what I'd like to do, and the point for therapy for me is to provide insight for you into yourself and to be able to make patterns around wellness. So my goal is what are you doing that's working, and what are you doing that's not working? So one of the things I asked you about what you're looking forward to, that made me really genuinely happy that you had something concrete that you could go to, because I remember feeling very depressed. And and I share, um, if it's appropriate, self-disclosure. Do you know what that is in therapy? Self-disclosure.
I think I know what it means, but is there a different term in therapy rather than just
It
looking
is.
for?
It is.
Okay.
So when a therapist says to you, like what I was just getting ready to use, right? So if you think it's helpful, you might share something about your personal life, right? So there was this myth that therapists are supposed to have a blank slate. Are you familiar with the book? Oh God, what is it? You need to talk to somebody. Oh, that's not the right title. What is the name of it? I think you need to talk to someone. Lori Gottlieb is the author of the book.
I'm not familiar with that one.
It's okay. It's okay. She's a therapist and it's fictional, but it's really an interesting book. But one of the things that she says in that book is you self disclose, right, when you think it's going to be helpful, not because we're chatting, right? So it's not like, hey, oh, oh my gosh, you're on Zoloft. I'm on Zoloft too, right? Because that's a different thing, right? If you think it would be helpful, if the person is very resistant to taking a medication, and you might offer, well, when I was going through something, I found that, I took an antidepressant. It really helped provide clarity, right? But you're supposed to be thoughtful around it because what's your intention with it? Because it's such an intimate, you're actually really raw and naked. I think about the topics that are interesting to me in therapy. So I do think, when is self-disclosure important in therapy? What's the difference between therapy and life coaching? How do you break up with your therapist or end therapy if you don't think you're getting what you need? Starting therapy is also a lot like online dating. You don't know people, they pick you. I mean, I always laugh because I'm like, I wonder how people are like looking through profiles and they're like, oh yeah, you, I'm gonna give you a shot, right? Right now, it's so hard to get a therapist to even like send you an email back
Why is that?
because we're so busy actually seeing people. So I had not one break today, not one break, did not eat lunch, did not do a personal phone call. I have eight sessions today with clients all the way through from 9 to 5. And then I came here, jumped on this call, and then I have one at 6:15 and another at 7. Right. So if you think about that, so then that will be eight. I mean, I'm sorry, that will be 10 sessions, right? That I have to write notes on, that I have to process. But in every session, that's why I felt bad with you, Joe, because um, because it's an intimate, it's like you have my undivided time when we're right. That you should never feel like your therapist is like thinking about their shopping list when they're talking to you, or like their other problems. So I felt bad because like when you caught me, unfortunately, I was like finishing my day of other people, and then my job of being a mom jumped in, right? And so like being a person, I don't even have time to be a person. Like I'll think about that like when I'm in bed. But just to go back, some of the topics that are interesting because it's sort of like the inner working of it. So I had 8 people share their lives with me today in a super intimate way. I had to write and document what happened in that, what interventions I used, um, and what's the plan for the next time, right? So it's like 8 little mini reports. And some of the things I like to think of was I helpful? Did that person? It's like one of the things I first say is, how have you been since we last spoke? And usually, I mean, sometimes people say things like, I didn't really like, I had a woman say last week, I felt I was disappointed that you didn't, um, ask me more about this date that she had. And the reason I didn't ask her is because she didn't say much she wanted to talk about it, but that's not the nature of our relationship, right? But in being passive aggressive, she didn't tell me. She wrote me this long email about it that maybe I'm not interested, blah blah blah, right? But right, and my response was, I'm looking forward to seeing with you next week to talk about this, right? Because that's not the relationship you have with your therapist. That's a relationship you have with a friend, right? You write your friend an email and you say, so maintaining boundaries is difficult. And the other thing is that people don't know is that we actually really care about, that it's not, I think it can feel detached, but I don't think anybody can really help you transform and get to wellness unless they genuinely care about you.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Like, and first off, you have no reason to feel bad because I totally understand. Like, I studied psychology when I was in college, so just by studying everything, like, I understand just how much busyness is on a psychologist's plate. So it's perfectly fine. And again, like I'll even take some accountability and say there were some things I could have done to speed up the process too. So it's perfectly fine. And but yeah, like I feel like as a psychologist, you have a lot of investment that I think goes overlooked by the, I suppose, average client because the client just sees you and the space you share when you're seeing each other from say 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, the patient doesn't see that you have the same type of relationship with eight, nine, 10 other clients every day, 7 days a week. And when you have to try to build that relationship with so many people, that kind of gets murky when one feels neglected in a way. So I think you're definitely fine there. And I guess I should also ask, I didn't have a chance to ask like earlier, but I try to like check in with all my guests, but like with everything on your plate, just how are you feeling on an emotional, physical, spiritual level, especially with everything else going on in the world?
It's such a great question. I have had to really step up my reinforcements is the word I'm going to use. Um, I'm getting tired, so I usually I'm an optimist, very strength based, but um, particularly in this week, I think I felt like, wow, we don't have a lot to look forward to. We're getting ready to go into, it's getting dark earlier, it's cold, we can't spend time with loved ones. Um, some of the simple pleasures, I used to love to go to the movies. Just, it was like in fact, one of my offices is like a block away from a movie. So I literally could like hide from my kids and be like, after they don't know I had another session, I would be like, I'm just gonna go to a movie. And it would help me separate from the evening the same way somebody would like drink a glass of wine or like eat something. It's like I'm gonna decompress. But I'm feeling a little depleted, Joe, is the best. And the thing is, as much as I believe in medications, I know the only way to actually do it. So it's like I listened this morning to an affirmation on YouTube. It was Denzel Washington talking to a graduating class. It's a great YouTube video. It's maybe 10 minutes. but he's basically talking about taking risks and taking chances, believing in yourself, putting faith in God. And I'm like, everybody needs that like reinforcement. You're amazing. You're going to be okay. This is temporary. You're going to get through this. Um, so like I realize like I on average do that 8 to 10 times a day with somebody, and I don't necessarily get that filled back in, right? Because I'm mostly giving, I'm not really receiving. So I would just say for all of us, including you, Joe, that like if you're not watching yourself, you can wither away, and your mental health is something that you have to like actively work for. Like to achieve wellness, it's really no different than if you want to be fit, right? You actually have to exercise. Would you agree with that? There's no getting out of that.
Yeah, I agree, especially as someone who's picked up exercising, bodybuilding, like the to put in the work, you got to put in the work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I have thought about myself on this journey, and I say every time is like when I stop doing something, and like then I can't do a push up. I'm like, well, how could you do a push up? You haven't done any arm work. Like I'll do just cardio because it gives me the endorphins and it feels good. But then when I'm weak and like even picking up the 15 pounds, right? Like 15 times, and I'm like, right, I have to be consistent in order for it to make a real difference. But it's the same thing with mental health. You've got to consistently put positivity, light, um, having things to look forward to, writing in your journal, spending time with people that really make you feel good or better, and in really getting a sense of accomplishment. I'm sure you probably feel accomplished. I don't know the story of how you started doing this, um, but you must feel accomplished around it.
Yeah, I actually feel very accomplished. It's kind of ironic, like the last interview I did, like we kind of had a conversation about like the kind of accomplishment you feel from doing something so small like this. Like in my head, like doing a podcast like this, having these conversations, it's such a small gesture, but because people get a lot out of it, be it being inspired or just being their step one to go therapy, it means a lot to somebody in the world, and that kind of warms me up a little bit.
It warms you, but it's also, so we call black male therapists unicorns. That's what like me and my friends call them. Like we're like, and so anytime I can even remotely get, and I actually do have quite a few male clients that I work with, but I'm always trying to encourage people to consider it as a field, because just by your gender or just by seeing you, there are people that like are like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited. And so many times we don't think about what we do, what roles we play. So you didn't think that when you started this podcast it was going to do all of this, right? But here we are. And somebody else who's searching for podcasts and on whatever platform they search for them. And are you interested in like how many people you reach, or do you care about that? What's your ultimate goal with this?
Just for people to just kind of like heal from this in a way, like not heal completely, because I think healing is like a constant process of just it's just a constant process. And more than anything, I just hope that this is like the first step for people to like kind of see what they're going through themselves. Like they hear what my guests are talking about, they kind of try to relate that to themselves, and maybe they think to themselves, oh, like I can use this information to work on myself, or I can use this information to start my first therapy session. Like I hope I start like that going on with people.
No, I think you're right. I think it's like whatever it does, it's better than not doing anything, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it's funny. Like every time I had thought about making a podcast, and I felt like there are other people that are doing this, but nobody is you, right? So even if other people, right? So me doing one, you do, but the other part was I didn't really feel that inner motivation because I felt like other people are doing it and it will come to me, like I'm actually in the rooms with people. So I could talk also, you see these therapy cards?
Mm-hmm.
They're really interesting. There's some of the things that I use that help develop insight in sessions with people, particularly when people go, I don't know why I'm here. I just I don't know, right? And you're like, well, you don't know. And on these questions, um, they're very specific uh, kinds of questions and specific things around triggers. I'll just give you a perfect example. What advice would you give to your future self? Some of the other ones are things like, what do you need to forgive yourself for? And what narrative is at play with you? Like, is there a specific narrative? Like, Joe's a loser, or Joe's the greatest catch ever. Joe is even if you feel like, this idea that you're struggling. I mean, I think, like, me being busy, like I said, I'm going to stop saying that because my therapist once said to me, you control your schedule, correct? And I said, yes. And she said, so if there were too many things on your schedule and you are empowered and have agency, why would you say, yeah, why don't you not have so many things on your schedule?
I think that's a good point. Like that goes back to something I was talking with a nurse about a little bit, Mickey Malkovich, and we we were both kind of relating as people who put a lot of stuff on their plate, and we both said like, oh, like I've got too many things, X amount of things, and she kind of talked about how like it's all about making yourself available, and if you can't be afraid to like knock things off that schedule or just shift your schedule or simply just say no, like me personally, like there was a time where like I was having trouble saying no, and that's another thing I mentioned the last interview I recorded, and it was very much like having I guess like a sense of duty to so many things, and also just wanting to add something to someone's lives. Like it could be like doing someone a favor or like helping someone with something, but it was also bogging me down mentally trying to add so much to my plate, and that's why I had to learn like, oh, I can't say yes to everything, and I've got to pick and choose what I give my energy to, you know?
You absolutely do. I have a very, very important question now.
Hmm.
Is that Eminem behind you?
Yes, it is. It's a digital media company I founded. It's called Uplift United, and it's got a podcast network and essays. The very first essay we dropped, a writer talked about, they compared Eminem to 19th century poet Lord Byron. And I got this local Detroit artist to make a cover art for the essay, and he also made me a physical copy as well. So I just hung that behind me.
I was hoping it was Eminem. I was gonna say, it could be anything,
Hmm.
but I was like, that looks like Marshall Mathers. I think that's Mr. And then you told me, I deduced it once you said you were from Michigan/Detroit, so that makes a lot of sense. Around traumas specifically, um, I'll just use this example. So I worked in foster care for a long time, and the kids in foster care, the clinic and agency that I worked with, wanted them all to have something called trauma focused CBT. And in trauma focused, that's cognitive behavioral therapy. And in trauma focused CBT, you have to write a narrative discussing the traumas that you've experienced. That's the main part, is that it be narrative based. And I remember being so conflicted because it was often re-traumatizing kids who had either sexual abuse by a parent, whose parents who were in jail, on drugs, or incarcerated, or something that put them in the foster care system. And every time they experienced someone that was supposed to be a healer, a helper, a social worker, they wanted to take them right back into the trauma without dealing with engagement. So I say that to say, there isn't a one size fits all, and that specifically how you deal with trauma as a young person, how you do. I do think that using a journal is a great way, in writing and processing your feelings, but it's not necessarily good for everybody. So if you're dyslexic, and this was what I was going to say about, like, recommending books, like, it's great to recommend books if books are your thing, and you're a higher, you're an intellect, but there are people that would be so turned off, um, because the language, it doesn't feel as accessible. So then I'll just give you a perfect example. This gentle step by step guide would be a lot more difficult. I mean, a lot more easy for them to do. Like, so why is this feeling hard for you? Where do you think it might have come from? There are questions, but there's a lot. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Um, and it's, again, so right, whether or not I use these cards, it's really going to depend on the person and what feels good for them. So there's not, even if I say, at NYU I was trained in a very psychodynamic Freudian, right? It's like that shit's not going to work if the person is like, baby, I graduated from 8th grade. I don't, what do like I have to work. Not that they're any less intelligent, but I'm not necessarily going to use, right, psych notes. I'm not going to use um, language that's going to make them feel less than.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like it's very much like you have to be patient with them. Sometimes you need to meet some patience in the middle and some not to like look down on anybody. Like some people you have to go a little bit higher, others lower, and not necessarily lower as in like lower IQ or anything, just lower on like wavelengths, different wavelengths type of
That's
thing.
right. And the depths, and not everybody's going to be ready at the same time. So instant. Oh, did I lose you?
Oh, I'm still here. Did I go out a little bit?
Nope.
No.
But my that's what happens when no, I don't have a grip. I was looking to see what time my next thing was, and the screen wasn't there, but my camera's there. So I forget that, Joe.
Okay.
I'm not advanced like that sometimes,
No,
right?
it's
So
fine. I was gonna say like it's getting close to
yes,
6:15. Like, and I know I said I was gonna like keep an eye on things, but I was like waiting for a way to like wrap up the podcast. But like I didn't want to interrupt you, so I apologize in advance for making this longer than we planned. But I thank you for coming on.
thank you, and I'm glad that you asked me. I do. One of the things that I do want to say is that, like, so therapists are real people, and as most of us are so connected to the broken people that we're working with, that's what makes people want to do this, right? Like the people that want to do this, right? Even you, right? You must care about this in a different way. So I want to just not only thank you, but just say, um, it's a wonderful thing to be able to like use the healing forces that we have, for good, because we've never done anything like this. I like for years, like when you think about, like I do think a lot about like slavery and just like 100 years ago, like nobody would be talking about the idea of going to a therapist. Nobody. And so we've made like huge leaps, except that we've been traumatized for years. Like since we got to this country, we've been traumatized.
Yes, unfortunately, and I wish we could talk more about that because I really love this conversation. But again, like you have a session
Yes.
in 10 minutes, but I thank you for coming on. I do have one more thing that's going to be very quick. I like to end every session by saying there's a segment I like to call "Giving People Their Flowers," where I tell my guests, in case we never speak again, just how much I appreciate them, and I appreciate you for one, just being patient with me, not just only in this interview, but just in the steps to get to this interview. Because, like, I know you took accountability earlier, but I also could take some accountability. I could have made a smoother transition, but I thank you for still being patient with me along the way and still after trying to do this for 1, 2 months, we're still here. So I thank you for that commitment, and I appreciate you just for just offering all the tips, all the tools you've learned in the psychology field, and just sharing on social media through your Instagram accounts. I think that's really cool, and like it helps people who may not necessarily have the privilege of going to a therapist or affording a therapist. They can just look at your Instagram accounts and just relate what you talk about to themselves. I think you're an incredibly smart, analytical person from just the interactions we've had. And I already know for a fact you're a phenomenal therapist. And I hope you just keep being phenomenal in just life as a mother, as a psychologist, and just everything. And I hope you find time to just decompress, be happy, all that jazz. And I thank you again for coming on.
Wow. That's a beautiful bouquet of flowers. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. I can't wait to hear it. Have a really good night.